Hi there. Welcome back to Tuesday's Tips. I'm Greg Kaiser, and in this weekly feature, we're talking about editing within Lightroom. And we've been going through all of the global editing tabs here for the past several months now. Had some really good feedback on the content, and I'm glad that it's helping a lot of you. If there's anything you would like me to cover specifically, don't hesitate. Drop a comment, send me an email. Let me know, because I would like to do these videos with things that are important to you. Right now I'm just kind of going through all the basic tabs on global edits and getting us to a point where we can understand a lot of what's going on when I start talking about the local edits, which is where the power of Lightroom really is. We're going to go ahead and get into things. So you should see the Lightroom screen up on yours. And just as a real quick review, we've been through the basic tab, calibration, color mixer, tone curve, color grading, detail, that was last week's. Transform, that was several months ago. That's kind of old news at this point, but there was a good video on that. If you haven't caught it, go back and check it out. This week we're looking at effects. And in the effects tab, we actually have two different blocks. There's post-crop vignetting and grain. The reason that these two are in the effects tab, I think, is because they are both kind of creative effects. We're going to talk about both of them today. We'll start out with post-crop vignetting, and post-crop is very important because that means that once you apply this, if you do decide to change the crop or even the aspect ratio, that effect is going to follow along with the new framework, as opposed to it's just going to have weird darkening in areas that you didn't intend. So if you apply this effect and then change your crop or aspect ratio later on, that will follow with it. So that's a very good thing, and they just remind you that in the title. Now as you come down here and look, you have style, which is set highlight and priority, highlight priority as a default. We'll talk about that again here in a second. The first slider is amount, and that's the only slider that you have access to at this moment. You also have midpoint, roundness, feather, and highlights. Those happen after you start to bring in an amount. And there's two ways in which you can do the vignetting. Number one is kind of a old photography style where the edges bleed out. And basically by dialing in that positive vignetting, you're making things brighter. And you can see down here in the corners of the dark green, we've started to make it a lot brighter. You can't really see it in the edges in the brighter areas, but that's why I chose this photograph, because I think it's going to illustrate the point on all points that I want to make. The other end of that spectrum is we darken the corners, and this is where most everybody is going to use the post-crop vignetting tool. It's going to be to darken it, and it's a lot of the way optically that old lenses would work on cameras, and they just didn't have the brightness in the corners, so there would be this natural light fall off. The perfection of digital lenses has kind of eliminated that problem. So this allows us to bring that back in, and you see up here in the top, the lighter areas have been darkened, and of course the darker areas have been darkened also. And to make this a little bit easier to see, I'm going to dial in just a little bit more, so that way we can see what's going on. And before I get into a whole lot of detail, I want to discuss the difference between these styles. Highlight priority is what it defaults at. That's what I use generally, and what that means is the brighter areas, in this case the situation with the cloud inversion down here in the lower areas, that is going to be a highlight, and those tones are maintained a little bit better than the darker areas. You see in here even the mid-tones are darkened more than the highlights. So that is a look that I like for my pictures. Another one that I've used occasionally is color priority, and that is when you want to maintain more of an even darkening all around, but want to make sure that you don't lose the color information. In this situation, the greens and the blues are maintained, and it's just darkened a little bit. It depends on the situation. Normally, I like to just kind of bring the brightness down uniformly, and I'm going to lose a little bit of color, but I do it very subtly so you don't really see that. The last option is paint overlay. I don't really use that because what that does is it just reduces the contrast overall in the scene. It takes the blacks and shadows and I guess boosts them a little bit in the edges when you darken them, so it's really only darkening the highlights and the midtones. I don't like the look personally, although I'm not saying that in the specific instance where a picture needs this, it wouldn't look right. I don't shoot in the style that I think it looks good. So usually what I will have is the highlight priority checked, and I will dial in a much less amount, usually something around 11 or 12. That's where I would generally have my vignetting, but in order to see what we're getting ready to talk about, we're going to darken it back down to about 50. So that way we can see what we're looking at. And remember, before we change the amount, midpoint, roundness, feather, and highlights, none of those were active. We couldn't do anything. But now that we've dialed in an amount, we have access to these sliders. And the midpoint, it just changes kind of where in this frame that midpoint is going to be. We can make it bigger, which pushes the edges further out, or we can make it closer to the center, which brings those darkened edges closer in. So again, it's just you season to taste and see where you want. And what I have found most of the time for this feature, I like to keep the midpoint at the default at 50. If I'm going too far off of that, I'll do a custom vignette with a radial filter. So generally I will keep the midpoint where it is, but it is nice that they give you that opportunity to change the midpoint. You can also change the roundness, and by default it kind of goes with the framing of the image, but you can make this more round by pushing it over to the right. So you see now we have essentially a circle in the middle. We've gotten a lot of darkening here on both edges, not much top and bottom. We can go back and we can go the opposite way and go more oval, because that would be kind of how this picture is set up. And now you see we've got everything really pushed outside on the edges here. You see, we pretty much just made it very much along the edges of this frame. So again, I like to keep the roundness pretty much at the default. If I'm going to do anything beyond that, I'll do a custom radial. We'll get into that during local edits. Feather is one that I will use quite often, and we can change how that looks. Of course, if we dial all the feather out, we get this kind of view. I generally, if I will mess with this, I am adding more feather just to make it a little bit more gradual. So even with a really heavy -49 dialed into the amount, by feathering it more, it is not overly visible except right here in the exact corners. So it makes it a more subtle change, and I can go even more with that. Go to this eyeball up here at the top, and we can see what kind of change we've dialed in. Again, I do like just the basic feather. Now with the highlight, what we're doing is we are kind of making the lighter tones brighter. And you can kind of see where that comes in. We really are only focusing on the darks, and it works really well with this highlight priority up here because it's already giving a priority to the highlights. If we go to the color priority, same thing kind of applies. We can boost those highlights. So you can kind of use color priority and boosting the highlights to get you a more fine-tuned highlight priority. But it just comes into what you want to do with the picture. And if all you're doing is wanting to darken the corners a little bit, doing highlight priority and then dialing in something -12 or less is what I would recommend. And this is about where I would generally have my vignetting if I'm using this feature. And we can toggle this on and off, and we can see what we've done. It's very subtle, and it just kind of closes in the edges. For landscape pictures, I do like to do just this, but because this one has such a light and airy, foggy feeling, I didn't want to close that in. So I left the vignetting out of this one and kind of left it bright overall, because there is just a certain haze even down here that I didn't want to lose. And there was that atmosphere and just that feeling of the scene going further left and right. I wanted to keep that. And it wasn't a matter of dialing in the focal point right here in the middle. So just keep all those things in mind. There's ways in which you can do this vignetting. This is the easiest, and you can use it in unison along with local adjustments, or you can do local adjustments to do vignetting without doing this panel. But this kind of gives you an idea of what these sliders do. Now, grain has nothing to do with vignetting. It is different than digital noise, although digital noise has been equated with grain in a lot of situations. It's just an uglier version of grain. So grain is Lightroom's attempt at recreating a look that is done in film. And again, we have an amount slider that's active, but then we have size and roughness, which are not. But the minute we add an amount to the grain, we get size and roughness. Doing a grain adjustment on a picture is not necessarily the easiest thing, because it's kind of hard to tell what you're doing. Because if you dial in a certain amount of grain that looks good, and at that point you want to go down, play with the size, and it becomes kind of a guessing game. And then you end up with something kind of way over the top because you have felt like you need to increase stuff. And if you zoom in, you can see what's going on with the grain. That's what we started with, clean image, and that's where we've gone. And I think that is way too much. So I'm going to show you a different way of doing grain. Well, let me get these all zeroed out. Okay. Now, grain, in my opinion, is best used in a black and white picture, because we think about grain in terms of black and white film. So our eyes are used to seeing that. Grain is also very beneficial when you have areas with very little texture. Those clear sky days, grain is really good to add texture and a little bit of visual interest into those areas. Now again, I did not use any of that in this picture. I wanted the smooth look, but this is going to be a good indication or a good example of what grain can do in areas that don't have a lot of detail. It's a very clean image and everything worked the way that I wanted it. But had I wanted to bring a little bit of texture into these areas of negative space, I could do that with grain. And this is how I recommend doing it. Go ahead, max out the grain. Looks ugly, I know. We're not going to leave it here, but it allows us to see a couple things. Number one, we can still see the edge of this ridge. That's important because we're going to go down here to size, and we are going to change the size of the grain gradually up until we start to lose that line of the ridge. So at 36 we're losing it, it's softening. So I'm going to dial it back down to 31. We can still see the line of that ridge. Same thing with roughness. We're going to go up on the scale until we just start to lose it, and at 60 we're starting to soften that. So I'm going to dial it back, say around 57. This is where we're at, and to me that's way over the top, but we still have all of our edge detail. But remember, I said that the amount of 100 was temporary, just to let us see what we were doing. So we were able to see this line. Now we start to dial the amount back until we get to the amount that we like to see. And something about there looks pretty good to me. And if I zoom out, you can see that the overall sharpness of the image is not affected because we maxed out the amount and we did the size and roughness based on edge detail. Then we dialed the amount back so that we can really see the picture. But these areas that have very little texture in the fog, in the sky, even here with the hazy mountains, that now has a texture. And we can take that effect away by hitting that eyeball, and we can see the smooth picture, and then we can see the grainy picture. And the grain is all about how you want to render your picture. And to me, if I wanted grain, this would probably work. I could maybe tweak it down just a little bit more, something around there. And that looks pretty good. So the grain has given us the ability to bring this texture in. Now another example of when grain is good is when you have a little bit of a soft focus issue. If areas of your picture are not in the focus that you would really like, you can add a little bit of grain, and that's going to bring a little bit more sharpness in. It just gives edge detail in certain situations. Even here on this ridge, which is relatively sharp focused, but you can see where we've got some texture and it's giving some edge detail. If we take that away, it's just kind of a gradual gradient. So if you end up with a really good picture that you might have missed the focus on, this is a good opportunity to go in and kind of correct that error. So just keep that in mind. But again, on how to work grain, let's see, let me go ahead and redo this again. Zero all these out. You want to find an area that has a reasonably sharp line. We'll move it down to here so you can see it a little bit different. We max the amount out. We still see that line because that is very, very crucial. We use the size slider to go to where that is softened. And you see if I go 100% how that line is now softened. You want to just gradually move up until that line starts to soften. And somewhere right around in there, it softens. So we dial it back there. Same thing with roughness. We see if we zero or get close to zeroing it out, what the grain looks like. Looks like amoebas and plankton and stuff in science class when I was in high school. But we kind of change the roughness, and again, if we go all the way to 100, you see how we've lost that edge. We still see it, but it's very, very disrupted. So we want to do this gradually also and bring it into somewhere right around in there. And at that point, now that we still have this line, we can bring the grain amount back to where it looks pleasing to our eyes. And somewhere right around in there looks good. We look at the picture as a whole, and we make our decisions there. So grain is a little bit more convoluted than other things as far as getting it set, and there's a certain technique to doing it without having it going overboard or looking odd. Just remember, keep those edges. So I'm going to zero these back out because this is a master file of mine, and remember, I didn't use grain or vignetting in this at all, so we're back to where it was. So that pretty much covers everything. Let's see. And hopefully now you have a little bit better understanding of a couple of the creative tools within Lightroom. Vignetting is something that I use very often, either through this tab or through local adjustments. And a lot of times, probably more than half the time, I'll use a combination of the two. I'll darken the edges and then I will change where the focal point is within the frame with a different layer of vignetting. And we'll get into some of that later on. Grain, I use that primarily in black and white. I use it in black and white portraiture a lot more than I do landscape work. I like a good clean landscape image, unless I have a very blank sky, in which case I'll add a little bit of texture to that sky, a little bit of visual interest. But generally the grain, I will use that for more portraiture, and I think it does suit portraiture to have kind of a film emulation a lot of times, especially in black and white. For those that are using Lightroom, there has been a recent update, and it's some AI cloning or AI content delete. So I haven't had a chance to play with that. I just updated Lightroom today. As it turns out, we're going to be getting into some of the cloning, content aware delete, and that sort of thing in the next couple of weeks. So I'll have a chance to get in and talk about how that works. I just want to work with it a little bit before I start saying, hey, this is how to use this. I'm not a huge fan of AI tools. AI masking is really good, and the content aware delete has been phenomenal. So I imagine that this is going to be pretty good as well. I've looked at it. It looks like it's fairly straightforward, but we will get into that here in the next couple of weeks. I do want to finish up with the basic tabs over on the right-hand side for doing global edits and get everybody kind of on a good baseline before we get into the local adjustments, because I want to stress that all the local adjustments are doing the same adjustments that we've been doing, but with certain areas of the picture. And that's where the power of Lightroom and most image editors really comes into play. So I look forward to getting into that. But for now, we're going to go ahead and call this one a day. I appreciate everybody that stuck with me through 45 minutes last week. This one has not been nearly that long. So I look forward to next week, seeing you guys again. Until then, happy shooting, happy editing, and we'll see you next week. Bye now.